The Department of Health and Human Services announced it has frozen all child care payments to the state of Minnesota. Joining us to discuss is Simon Hankinson, Senior Research Fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. So, good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us today. And HHS Deputy Secretary Jim O'Neill said that they're turning off the money spigot to stop the misuse of federal dollars. What is your initial reaction to this move?
Well, if you've got a massive leak, the first thing you want to do is stop it, right? And then investigate the causes of the leak. This is a monumental scandal. We know that, especially during COVID, there was a rash of fraud across all these federal programs with the billions of dollars pouring out of the Treasury. But this particular concentration of fraud is worrying in that it is in one particular community in one particular state, and the scale of the fraud. It's not just child care centers, autism, housing, just a range of benefits. I think that that is a wise policy to stop the money flowing until you can verify who it's flowing to. If people can show that they genuinely qualify for these programs, then they should get the money. But unless they can prove that they have children with special needs or that are going to these daycare centers, they shouldn't get it. And I think a longer term project has to be to seriously look at why the federal government is subsidizing housing through Medicaid, which is not anything to do with medical care, and maybe put some more responsibility on cities and states to pay their own bills so that they pay when fraud happens and not people in Washington, D.C. and North Carolina and Florida.
Okay, let's talk about the requirements here. Before this action by HHS, what were the requirements for a state to qualify for federal funding through the Administration for Children and Family, also known as the ACF? And is there anything that needs to be improved in this process so that we see less fraud?
Well, I'm not an expert on federal benefits programs, but what is clear is that the oversight on these programs was ridiculously lax. Now, I would argue, I'm a conservative, that the fact that all these programs existed in the first place was a mistake. I don't think the federal government should be responsible for feeding and caring for the entire population regardless of need. I think when you have high concentrations of poverty like this, it should be more of a state and local concern, but that's a separate issue. If the programs do exist and they have rules, there should be adequate oversight. And what we've been seeing is that inspectors were going to these daycare centers and they were looking up and realizing that there are all kinds of mistakes and things, boxes that weren't being ticked in terms of regulations, and they didn't seem to follow up and make sure that there were actually children attending and staff who were qualified, who were holding these classes, and that the whole operation was being run properly. So it's a bit of a mess from a regulatory point of view, from the bottom all the way up to the top.
Okay, Simon, so you mentioned oversight a few times now. How in your view, did this happen? How did we get to this point where fraud in Minnesota has now become a national story?
I think there's several different layers to this, but what I really think should not be overlooked is that politicians in Minnesota, from Tim Walz to his lieutenant governor to the attorney general, right on down to the mayor of Minneapolis, were pandering to this Somali community for electoral reasons. And they seemed really averse or frightened of investigating genuine leads because they were worried about the political implications. And look, I don't care where the fraud is coming from. If it's Somalis, if it's third generation Minnesotas of Scandinavian origin, who cares? The fact is, people shouldn't steal money. And I'm sure that a lot of members of the Somali community don't want to see federal money and local benefits money stolen if maybe they could qualify for programs that money could pay for. So across the board, this is a political failure. This has been hiding in plain sight. I was a consular officer for many years, and I've seen a lot of fraud. And as soon as you start pulling a little bit on the thread of a fraudulent case, it very quickly unravels and becomes obvious. And then you can start passing it over to prosecutors to take care of business. But in this case, it seemed like there was little curiosity on the part of the officials who were supposed to be responsible for these programs, partly because, it's state and federal money. And they figured, well, we can just, as long as they're not asking questions, why should we ask questions? And they're not being good stewards of our money.
Okay, Simon, you mentioned the Somalian community and other communities. Is there an argument to be made about the design itself of these programs? That there may be gaps that potentially can be easily exploited, not by just one group, but by any person or group?
Absolutely. Look, I have lived in countries that are extremely corrupt, low trust societies, you might call them, where it's very common, to cheat on exams, to not pay your taxes, to cheat on paperwork, whether it's for real estate purposes, driver's licenses, right through the entire society. The United States has not traditionally been that kind of place. Yes, we have our issues. We do have corruption from time to time, but it's not very common for people to pay bribes, for example, to get a driver's license or to get off a speeding ticket or to be able to build a house where you're not supposed to build a house. Those are exceptions, I would say, in the United States. They are not exceptions in Somalia and in many other countries. And so for people coming from those countries, they need to be educated. They need to understand how our system works. And to do that, you have to enforce rules. And I think in this case, the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis, or the Twin Cities, just completely failed in their duty, and as a result, we're all going to pick up the pieces and pay what looks like over $1 billion of money that's disappeared.
Okay, so Simon, yesterday we talked to a guest, and I asked him if he thought uh, the state of welfare in Minnesota, whether that's overly generous or not. You've already alluded to this. Can you just talk a bit more, your thoughts on whether federal subsidies of this kind are excessive and too unregulated, not just in Minnesota, but across the country?
I think they are. And I think it's not just in the United States. If you look across Western Europe, there have been some studies in the past few years that have demonstrated conclusively that refugees and people from certain countries are massive net drains to the fiscal health of the country over their lifetimes. Now, a country can choose to make that decision, and they can choose to pay out for individuals, but they have to understand the costs that go with that. And I think in a state like Minnesota, if you look at the percentage of Minnesota born, so native born Americans who claim benefits, is significantly lower than the percentage of Somali immigrants, and I'm sure other communities that are on benefits. There's something like a study by the Center for Immigration Studies showed that almost 90% of Somali-led households with children were on some kind of federal welfare benefit program, whereas it was only like 25% among the population as a whole. So you have programs that are designed for people who are indigent, who are in real need, that are vulnerable to exploitation and fundamentally have limited budgets. I think the housing program had a budget of like $3 million. That was what they expected to spend, and it ballooned up to well over 100 million in a very short time because of abuse. So yeah, federal welfare and even state and local welfare cannot be a blank check because the revenue coming into the coffers is not unlimited.
Okay, Simon, just one last question. I'm just thinking about solutions here. Do you think if we could just end illegal immigration through whatever means, do you think that will have a huge impact in reducing fraud?
Well, ending illegal immigration, yes, would have a huge impact on a lot of things. It would free up housing. It would make the job market more lucrative for Americans and legal immigrants competing for jobs. But this is a question of legal immigrants. Most of the Somalis involved in these scams are either U.S. citizens by naturalization or some by birth, or they are legal immigrants, or they're under some permanent status as refugees, for example, on their way to being legal permanent residents and citizens. So it's not just a question of illegal immigration. It is a question of the number of people that we're bringing in who have limited job skills, no English, and no ability to ever in their lifetimes produce more income and give more taxes to the state than they're going to take out in benefits from health to education to all of these, 80 plus federal welfare programs we have. And that's not to stigmatize anybody, but it's just a fact of life. If you are going to bring in large numbers of people from countries where they are not at the skill level where they're going to be able to contribute, you're going to have a net loss to the fisc every year. And I think that's something that no one has really taken paid much attention to over the past few years. We've been sold the opposite. We've been told that all immigration is good because they will all contribute to the economy and make us all richer. But the data is just not there to back that up.
Okay, Simon, just one final question for real this time. Is there an argument to be made that these legal immigrants who are in the United States, they may not have the skills initially, but over the lifespan of their stay in the United States, that over time they'll make up the shortcomings in the beginning later on?
Frankly, it depends where they come from. Not all immigrants are the same. There's been some research, a guy called Daniel DiMartino out of the Manhattan Institute, who I don't always agree with on immigration, but he wrote a good paper recently breaking down which immigrants contribute over their lifetime and which don't. And obviously, this is not an exact science, but for example, a 30-year-old rocket scientist from China or India or Belgium over his or her lifetime is likely to contribute significantly more into the U.S. Treasury than they take out. But an illiterate, non-English speaking, non-high school educated immigrant from Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia, for example, will take out more in their lifetime than they put in. So you have to look at who has been coming in over the past few years. Look at the profile of the people, for example, from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Afghanistan who've been admitted under these parole programs. You plug them into that model, and you will find that a majority of them probably will not contribute in their lifetimes. Who knows? I mean, obviously some will. There's always exceptions. There's going to be some brilliant people among the ones who come in, and maybe their children and grandchildren will turn out to be, doctors and lawyers and rocket scientists and presidents of the United States. But we don't know that. What we know for now is that on balance, they're probably going to be a net loss to the Treasury.
Okay, Simon, really great insight today. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.